the third category, the captains of hundreds, are quite similar to the captain of 50s, but they've got a few extra things. He's got a clearer ability to rule, and he can delegate tasks. He doesn't do everything himself. He knows how to, but he only releases people to serve. He doesn't release people in the way that the captain of 1,000 does, and I'll come to that in a moment. He releases people to serve. Right, John, you look after the PA system. Fred, you look after the worship. Jack, you maintain the property, and Jane, you manage the finances. But nevertheless, it all comes back to him for real decision and for real government. So he's delegating in a servant way. He can produce servants. He can produce, if you like, deacons, but he can't produce leaders with any power, vision, or authority of their own. Have you got the picture? And you can think of churches like that, and the average local church is like that. He often has plurality of leadership, but they are helpers and servants to him. And he never really releases control. He couldn't imagine, for example, the young people going off to camp without him going along with them, just to make sure everything's okay. So you've got a youth leader that's never quite released to fully develop the gifting and calling that's upon him, because there's the pastor always there, just keeping an eye on things, just keeping a hand on things, and they never feel that absolute release. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? He feels insecure if he doesn't know all that's going on and has to have a hand in it personally. He longs for someone to consult and to be accountable to, but he often doesn't have that. He's quite often insecure as a number one, though often functions that way because he has to prove himself. He's not able to identify gift and ministry. He doesn't know how to release and develop gift. He's not, if he's not secure, men of greater gift threaten him, and that's particularly true of women, by the way. A man of greater gift threatens him because he feels that guy's got more than him, which of course he probably has. And it's even more threatening when it's a woman. So what happens is that they eventually have to leave and find something else. Okay? Now we come to captains of thousands, all right? And these equate to the Ephesians 4 ministry. He has an effective public ministry to large crowds. His ministry draws the people. He holds the people and is known by his public ministry. He's able to share his heart and is transparent publicly so that people really feel they know him and can trust and follow him, though he never has time and has a meal with everybody because that's physically impossible. Okay? He's a good organizer and a motivator on a broad scale. He releases areas of responsibility with power to make unilateral decisions to others, but still holds them accountable for the quality of what they do. I remember years ago when I was talking with Dr. David Yonggi Cho, he said, once I've really got to know a man's heart and I know his measure, then this is the phrase he used. Remember, English is his second language. He says, then I give them my power. In other words, I give him my authority. And I let him go and do what he has to do in his own way, expressing his own personality. All I'm concerned about is the quality of what he's producing. Oh, now that's Ephesians 4 gift ministry. You haven't got to do it my way, you've just got to do it well. Okay? It doesn't have to be an extension of me doing it. It's got to be you fulfilling yourself fully, but you're released within the parameters of what you're doing has got to be healthy for the whole work, and you mustn't do what you're doing to the detriment of the rest of the things that are going on in this organization. That's the only condition. Don't go and take all the youth away on a special weekend when we've already invited in so-and-so, and we're going to have a special time of prophetic prayer and praise and worship, because obviously I want the young people to be there at that time. But within those sort of parameters, just get them all saved, get them all filled with the Holy Ghost, get them all moving powerfully, do what you like, go where you like, stay within the boundaries of sound doctrine, but you can fully express yourself, and I'm going to be right with you all the way, encouraging you and exhorting you to go further and be bigger than you ever thought you could be on your own. Now that sort of leader is an emancipating leader. He gives you the confidence and the ability to be bigger, go further, and do more than you would ever have thought of doing if you were on your own. But these other types of leaders can be constraining leaders. They never let you go because they're afraid that you might go beyond where they are, and then they would feel now that you had made them feel inferior compared with your greater gift or ministry. Now, the first reaction of Ephesians 4, if you like, or a captain of 1,000, is when he sees a need, his first reaction is, can I find somebody to meet that need? The captain at 100 says, I've got to go and meet that need. In other words, this church needs better pastoring. Where can I find the pastoral people that I can train and release into that ministry? So he never himself becomes the answer to the need, but he seeks people that are able to be the answer to the need. His primary concern, well, halfway down the page, he inspires these gifted men and women and draws them on to be bigger and to do bigger things than they would ever do on their own. He's primarily concerned with leaders and motivating them and directing them. He understands submission and can work in a team under other men, as well as being able to lead. Because you'll find that to get a real city church going like I've described, you're going to need a whole sea of these people. And you're going to have a lot of people that are, the men that came to David, as we are going to see, obviously, well, later on today, I think it is, we will see that these men had their own private armies of thousands, but they decided that they were going to stop their own private army and come and be part of the great army under David because they saw the kingdom. They were perfectly capable of running a significant thing on their own. I remember one of the 10 men that is close to Dr. David Yonggi Cho. His name is Pastor Lee. He spoke very good English, and he was assigned to us as our sort of personal assistant while we were there. And this man, he said there was a time in the early days of Yonggi Cho's church when he did have a split, and there was a man that went off and took a bunch of people with him and started a church in a bad way, and it really hurt him. So he said to this friend, Pastor Lee, he said, I know you're a man of great gift, I know you're a man of great ability, and you could easily go off and start a great church. He said, look, if you want to go and do that, you go and do it, but go as an ally. Go as a friend. He said, don't go like this other guy did in competition and opposition, because that's not going to be good for the city. He said, what I'll do, he said, if you feel that's what God's laid upon your heart, he said, I'll give you $5 million and I'll give you 10,000 people, but go and start a church which is an ally to the one that I'm building here. Now that was quite an attractive offer to anybody, wasn't it? $5 million and 10,000 people to go start a church. He said, but Pastor Lee said no. He said, I'm called to serve you. I'm not called to go and start another church. And he said to me, he said, remember these guys, they're speaking a second language, English. He said, my purpose is to serve Yonggi Cho as God. Now that's what he said to me, and I know what he means. He doesn't mean I worship him as God. He means my whole service to God is expressed by the way that I serve Yonggi Cho. Now he's still there to this day. He could run a church of 100. He probably has responsibility maybe for 100,000 people, but he's there to serve Yonggi Cho. And these 10, what they were called big pastors, all basically had the same heart and attitude. Now, the reason there's a great church there is not because Yonggi Cho's so fantastic, but because of the men that have gathered around him and the women that have gathered around him. When I was last there, he had almost 1,000 full-time pastors who traveled across the city to minister all the different needs of the people. And I think it was about 700 or 800 of them were women. So by far the large majority of his full-time pastors were women. And he's got a tremendous revelation on how they function in the body. Okay? So he can work in a team. It doesn't mean because you're a captain of 1,000 that you're necessarily going to have your own work, because God may call you to be part of a team that's doing something much bigger than that. But some are called, the few are called, to be the James of the city or to be the David, if we're thinking of New or Old Testament. And our job is to get round them, to get behind them, and we're there to serve them to see the kingdom come. He's strong enough, now this is an English idiom I've realized, he's strong enough to grasp nettles. What I mean by that is that there's a certain weed in England called a nettle, which has got quite deep-seated roots, and the best way to deal with them is to get hold of them, preferably with a glove, grab them by the roots and pull them out. Now, you get a momentary sting in your hand, but the problem's solved. And so we have this idiom, grasping nettles, meaning that there's a difficult situation, there's that, obviously something going wrong there, and I'm not afraid to go and get hold of it and deal with it, even if there's temporary pain, providing it produces a final proper solution. And so when we find people out of order in a leadership team, we don't always pray to God. We do pray to God, but we don't just pray to God. We may have to go and get hold of it ourselves. do a bit of loving confrontation in order to nip that thing in the bud before it becomes damaging to our leadership team. And so a real leader isn't afraid to get hold of issues which need to be grasped in his leadership team and deal with them. So I said, well, brother, I just cannot stand confrontation. Well, no one likes it, but if you don't do it when it's necessary, you're going to be harming the person and the team which God's given you responsibility to lead. Amen? Now, another thing about these leaders is that they are secure enough not to have to be liked by everybody. Whatever, if you go flat out for God, you're going to be unpopular with somebody. And you're going to say, well, I'm going to serve God, and make sure that you're not just being unpleasant, but I mean, don't use that as an excuse. But finally, you're going to follow the Lord wherever he takes you. And someone is not going to like it, and yet that shouldn't bother you too much. All right? He fears God rather than the people. Because I've noticed certain people is they're always trying to sense what the people want, and then they pretend to lead them where they want to go. Well, that's not leadership. That's following them and making out your leader. Now, a lot of politicians do that sort of thing. They're always feeling out, they don't have any convictions of their own. They just want to be a successful politician. So let's send out feelers to know what the people want, and then I'm going to stand up and be the person that's proclaiming that. Well, that's not leadership. That's just baloney. He hears God, he fears God, and yet at the same time he's a lover of men, he's a servant at heart. Such gifts are born rather than trained. You can't make this happen. But nevertheless, in spite of that, there is a way in which such gifts and ministries are fathered into the maturity. And the Ephesians 4 ministry gifting particularly requires fathering, and that's my responsibility. That's my calling, is to be a father to these sort of men and develop them and release them and help them in 5 years to learn all that it took me 40 years to learn. As a result, they ought to go twice as far as I go. Amen? In other words, there ought to be a right kind of generational transmission. And that's what's been missing in the church. I remember it was the 50th birthday of Reinhard Bonnke. He was in Portugal doing an evangelistic crusade and also having a European Eurofire conference. And my daughter and son-in-law were organizing all this, and we were there to help in ministry and to be with him and with them. And it happened to be the occasion of his 50th birthday. Remember, we had this 50th birthday celebration. And we were sitting there, and I said, right, and he said to me, Alan, I do not think that I can probably continue like this for another, maybe 10 years. So I said, well, Reinhard, if that's true, if you've got 10 years to go, which I doubted was true, but I thought, well, I said, it's time you found and identified spiritual sons that you can train in the ministry and release them. I said, if you're going to finish crusade ministry in 10 years' time, you better make sure that you've got a whole batch of sons who've learned everything that you've got to teach them. And by the time you retire, they're already going beyond where you are, so this can be taken to an even greater increase in the next generation. I said, it's a responsibility we all have at our kind of age. And he took that word, and he has, as far as I know, got about 4 men now who he's training, he's releasing in ministry. They share with him. They even go off and do their own crusades now. So when Reinhard finally feels the end has come, it's not the end of the ministry. In fact, it's going to be expanding more rapidly. Now, this whole thing of generational transmission, which we learn from Moses to Joshua, and particularly from Elijah to Elisha, it's all part of that fathering ministry that's particularly the responsibility of these Ephesians 4 ministries. They've got to be fathering the next generation, which isn't necessarily 30 or 40 years, because in the Spirit it can happen much, much more quickly. So if you've got to that age that I'm talking about, and you are of this measure of gift, you should be asking God, who are the sons? And by the way, they can be male or female. I'm just using terminology here, and we'll look at this more fully tomorrow. that I ought to be trained. If you are going to be training people in ministry, I better just say this to be on the safe side. I do not father women into ministry. My wife does. Because, there's a dynamic of the opposite sex which is not even wise. There's a sort of intimacy of travelling to foreign countries together and doing these things together which you cannot possibly think of. So I just felt I better suddenly quickly correct that. What I'm saying is that there are Ephesians 4 ministries, male and female, that need to be properly mentored, would be perhaps the best word, by the appropriate sex. How's that? That's tactfully and well said. Now, to some extent, Eileen and I together can be a mum and dad to a ministry, and I've seen Eileen sort out some of these great apostolic men in a way that I wouldn't have dreamed of. So when it's a mum and dad together, it's even more fantastic. But there's an appropriateness that you've got to be very careful about. And so I do not have female spiritual sons, although I recognize that such things exist, and in the calling of God, their calling's legitimate. I'm just the wrong person to mentor them. Is that okay? Have I undone that one? I saw that trap coming, so I thought I better quickly say the right thing. Okay. Now, here's the final thing. Oh man, I've just seen the time. We just finished now. The early years of such men or women are often difficult because they serve under captains of 50s or thousands who tend to shut them down. So you could be a captain of 1,000 in a church led by a captain of 50, and that's a very frustrating experience. Now, I've met that many, many times. All they see is the local little group of people that they're totally absorbed with. They can't understand why you want to go and do something bigger or feel a bigger call upon your life. And they're all the time trying to teach you obedience and submission, and you're feeling this call to go out and to do something bigger, and it's a legitimate call from God. Well, if that is the situation, there will come a place where you will have to part company with that captain of 50. But you do it respectfully, you do it with great honor, with great thanksgiving for all they put into your life, but you're going to have to be mentored by someone who is of the gift measure which is clearly latent and apparent in your life. Does that make sense to you? And so they may have to move on, and I learned this early on, that I had to start taking men who were under captains of 50s and 100s, and I had to take them in hand to develop them, to launch them into their ministry, and I had to get the local pastors to release them to my care because they were not able to, they could pastor them in terms of character, but they couldn't develop them in terms of gift of ministry. And I had to untangle them from that loyal commitment to the local church which was killing them. You understand what I'm saying? And start to stretch them and develop them into something bigger, which was the true gift and measure upon their lives. And so that's something we may have to delicately and lovingly do. Now, if we're a whole bunch of churches working together as a one city church, these things are not difficult to do. But if we're a little tiny local church with a wall around where no one can possibly get in, this kind of thing goes on, and it allows a great loss of, because eventually, when they've for years and years and years submitted to a man who's much smaller in gift than they are, the very gift inside them can die. And they just become a rather disgruntled, fringe church member when they could have been on fire for God if only they'd been mentored by the right person. Amen? So these gift ministries are very, very important. And for each one of us to know what we are and who we are is equally important. Now, one is not superior to the other. They're just different, that's all. But when we stand before God and he's given us a clear measure in these respects, we should be rewarded for our faithfulness in what we were called to do, not the prominence to which we attained in the Church of Jesus Christ. So a faithful captain of 10 will have the same reward as a faithful captain of 1,000, providing he's done with his life and allowed God to do through his life all that God wanted to do. You cannot be more successful. Amen. So we need to start discerning these things and starting to start to fit these things into the proper order in order to release fully the glory of God's government in our churches.